Clodsire solves one of the biggest problems in Pokemon Sleep since the beginning of the game, but in its wake, leaving new problems for us to deal with. Welcome back to another Pokemon Sleep video, it's Brovini here. First, let's take a look at Clodsire's stats. It's a dozing type Pokemon that appears at Taupe Hollow and Greengrass Isle. It has a pretty atrocious speed at 58 minutes, which is even slower than its counterpart, Quagsire, at 56 minutes. But as you should know by now, what's important isn't just the speed, you also need to look at its ingredient rate, especially for an ingredient specialist. Speed alone is not going to tell you enough. And besides that, how good is the ingredient list and how many drops does it do? The three ingredients that it can do are cacao, coffee, and potato, with its main focus being either cacao or coffee depending on what you need. The amount of cacao that it drops are the same as Absol, the other mono cacao option, 2, 5, and 7. The amount of coffee it drops are 4 and 7 compared to Vikavolt, which is 2, 5, and 7, compared to Aggron, which is 0, 3, and 5. So it sits somewhere in the middle for the number of coffee it drops every production. But if you're not new to my channel, you should know that these numbers alone still don't tell you anything. You need to combine all of these numbers together, the speed, the ingredient rate, and the numbers dropped. And that's what we're assessing in this comparison. We are comparing the main cacao farmers in this game. Before Clodsire, Absol is the best at cacao farming. And while that still remains to be the case, there is an argument against Absol besides its cost. Blastoise is the more free-to-play option so that you don't have to hunt an Absol, which is 16 bars to catch. But also, Blastoise just provides you with more skill levels, more inventory. So as long as you reach level 60, Blastoise is still a very respectable cacao farmer. Comparing these Pokemon at level 60, Absol performs about 7% better in cacao farming than Blastoise if we ignore the milk productions. But these simulations assume that you collect your Pokemon frequently so that they don't reach their inventory limit. If they do, then the gap is closer because Blastoise has a larger inventory if you evolve it all the way from Squirtle. But one of the biggest problems we have had since the start of the game is if you choose to have a level 60 Blastoise, and I still don't, but let's say you choose to have one that has ABB ingredient list, milk, cacao, cacao, then you don't have a milk farmer. Or you may have a secondary Blastoise, but you don't have enough resources to bring it to level 60, so then you have a milk farmer that's level 30 only. So ideally, we would have a mono cacao Absol and then a mono milk Blastoise. But you probably know by now, having a mono cacao Absol is probably not realistic. It rarely spawns, and when it does, it takes 16 bars to catch. And on average, every 9 Absol you catch, 1 will be mono cacao, and then you gotta look for good stats. It's just not practical, which is where Clodsire comes in. We will continue to ignore main skills for now, but Clodsire, assuming that everyone is at max energy all day, provides almost exactly the same cacao as Absol, only very slightly less. We're talking about like a 2% difference between Absol and Clodsire. So Clodsire at level 60 beats Blastoise, doesn't quite beat Absol, but gets really close, with an inventory that sits somewhere in the middle. For such a small production difference between the two Pokemon, I don't think it's worth looking for an Absol anymore. In fact, this small of a difference will probably not beat the fact that it's going to be much cheaper to catch Paldean Wooper, look for a good stat, and mono cacao. In the amount of biscuits that it will take to farm Absol, you've probably found 3 times more Woopers. Not to forget that it also has a higher inventory, as long as you evolved it from a Wooper. So even from an ideal point of view, Paldean Wooper makes more sense than Absol. You're just more likely to get one with better stats in the amount of biscuits it takes to catch an Absol. Unless of course you start hitting friendship level 40 and then you're guaranteed 2 gold skills and you just can't get ingredient finder in that level 25 slot, then you might need to pivot your catches back to Absol to get that ingredient finding M stat. But I think for most people, sticking to Paldean Wooper for cacao makes the most sense. which frees up Blastoise to become Mono Milk. If you haven't already caught a Blastoise that is Milk, now is a good time to do so. Because between a Mono Milk Blastoise and a Mono Cacao Clodsire, you'll have half of the ingredients in Clodsire Eclair, the strongest dish in the game right now, covered. But investing in a Clodsire all the way to level 60 comes with a cost. The cost is the Whooper candies. What will you do for mushrooms if you're not using a Quagsire for mushrooms? Because both of these species share the same candies. Thankfully, before even Quagsire's arrival, it was always recommended to get a mushroom farming Gengar. So if you have one of these already, well, now it's got a job back. Invest in ABB Gengar all the way to level 60 and you'll farm a respectable amount of mushrooms. Although not as much as Quagsire, but what that does is it frees up Whooper candies to be used for Clodsire. Alternatively, you can pretend that Clodsire never got released, never existed, and just invest all of your Whooper candies into your Mono Mushroom Quagsire and continue to suffer a Cacao problem. Or maybe you're just one of those people with an Absol that does a lot of Cacao, in which case you don't need Clodsire either. So that means Clodsire's release means nothing to you. Or does it? Well, let's not forget there's another possible outcome for Clodsire: coffee farming. As we know, Vikavolt is the king of coffee farming. But if you can't find a good Vikavolt, you could use an Aggron that is ABB as a temporary option until you get a Vikavolt. As long as you got sausage covered by Charizard, you won't need Aggron to do sausages. So let's compare the coffee farming. You will really want Aggron at level 60 so that it can unlock the third ingredient to even come close to Vikavolt in coffee farming. At level 30, Vikavolt beats Aggron by a good 70% in terms of coffee production. This is them at level 60 and Vikavolt still beats Aggron by about 30%. And Clodsire suffers the same problem, is that it will be ABB ingredient list for coffee. So how does it perform? Let's say you have Clodsire at level 30. Unfortunately, it does even worse than Aggron, with Vikavolt beating Clodsire for coffee production by over 100%. In other words, there's almost no point of using Clodsire for coffee. Even at level 60, Vikavolt still beats Clodsire by nearly 50%. Not to mention, to invest all the way to level 60 means draining all of your Whooper candies you could use for a Mono Mushroom Quagsire. So it's just not looking good for Clodsire in coffee farming. But there is an advantage. Let's say you don't need your Whooper candies. You've already got a broken Gengar for mushrooms and you've already got a broken Absol or Blastoise for Cacao. Well, if you're a relatively new player, Clodsire is your only option to get a coffee farmer because it's available at Taupe Hollow, whereas all of the other coffee farmers are only available at Old Gold Power Plant. And I am referring to the ingredient specialists Vikavolt and Aggron. There are other non-ingredient specialists that can do coffee that you can farm outside of Old Gold Power Plant, but they're not realistic for making coffee productions. Whereas Clodsire can be found at Greengrass Isle, but will mainly be found at Taupe Hollow. So until you reach Old Gold Power Plant, this may be your only option. Is it worth getting a coffee Clodsire? Well, that depends on what the current strongest dishes that you can cook are. If you can cook all the largest dishes, then coffee is a meta ingredient at this point because all of them with the 61% recipe bonus include coffee. So we've got Hidden Power Perk Up Stew, Defiant Coffee Dressed Salad, and the most recently released Clodsire Eclair. But if the strongest dish you can cook is just Carmine Fruit Salad, well, there's no current need for coffee. Maybe you should wait until Old Gold Power Plant and actually farm a proper coffee farmer. So if not for Cacao or coffee, does Clodsire have any other use? Let's take a look at its berry count. One of my favorite topics to cover is whether a Pokemon can be a dual specialist. Dual specialist meaning it kinda is pretty good at something else besides its own specialty. And most commonly, we're talking about an ingredient or a skill specialist that has berry finding, because berry finding is not a percentage increase to a stat, it is an absolute increase to a stat. I covered this in much more detail in a separate video talking about dual specialty. Can Clodsire act as a dual specialist? Unfortunately, with its very atrocious speed, it doesn't work well for farming poison berries. In fact, even a Toxicroak, one of the oldest Pokemon in the game, available since release, beats it for berry farming if they both have Berry Finding S. But neither come close to the proper berry specialist in poison berries, and that's Arbok. Not to mention, we don't actually have a poison island yet, so it's pretty useless to be looking for a berry finding Clodsire at this point of the game. The only reason why this difference, this 98 to 141 difference, isn't even bigger is because Arbok also has an atrocious speed, with its frequency sitting at 56 minutes. So Clodsire is not a good berry finder, but it's even worse than Arbok, who's already not a very good berry finder. So the only thing left to assess now is its main skill. How does its main skill compare to others of its kind? So I've listed all of the self-healers here, and you can see Quagsire has always been at the bottom, and that remains to be the same. Clodsire does self-heal better than Quagsire. Even though it's slower than Quagsire, it has a much higher skill rate, but it sits somewhere in the middle of all of the self-healers. Although, in my opinion, self-healing isn't that important, because if you're really short on healing, let's say you do need Clodsire to heal a little bit more, give it a main seed. The lack of a skill trigger rate can be compensated if you're willing to part with some main skill seeds. So generally speaking, I find that self-healing main skill isn't crucially important. Even if it isn't triggering a lot, you just have to compensate for it by having a higher skill level. You might have noticed that Umbreon has dropped out of this list because Umbreon's main skill has changed, but it's still a self-healing. It's just that in some cases, it can also heal the team. Now, the last point I want to make about Clodsire is, remember in the last video we talked about speculations about the future of Pokemon Sleep, how will regional variants be introduced, and we use Vulpix and Alolan Vulpix as an example, because Vulpix Ninetales, across the two different regional variants, they have the same ingredient list and had the same specialty, and that is berry specialty. Well, as it turns out for Quagsire, we weren't expecting Clodsire to have the same ingredient list. What did remain the same though is their specialty and also their main skill. Both Clodsire and Quagsire have the same main skill, so our speculation now is that regional variants, well, something gets held the same, but it will depend on the specialty of the Pokemon. Of course, with such a small sample size, we are still speculating only, but I do feel it makes sense the way they're doing it. So if they were to release a Alolan Raichu, my guess is that it will be a berry specialist and have the same ingredient list as Raichu. But we haven't yet seen a skill specialist with a regional variant. So if a skill specialist gets released that's a regional variant, let's say Galarian Slowpoke, well, what will be held the same? Will it be its berry? Well, that wouldn't make sense because Galarian Slowpoke isn't water type at all. Thank you for watching, guys. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe and tell me what you think of Clodsire and whether you will be using one.